Rudi Lindner was right. Historians dislike nomads. He did not, but still had a hard time defining nomadism. Maybe he would have liked those nomads, but not others. A few years earlier, and unbeknownst to Lindner, François Hartog asked that fundamental question: how can one be a nomad? I quote, "The answer, according to the tradition, is simply by being a Scythian. It assumes an equivalence between the two terms. Scythians are nomads, nomads are Scythians," end of quote. Nomads like agriculture and do not dwell in houses. But according to Herodotus, nomadism was a way of life as well as a strategy, for nomads were beyond the reach of anyone who, like Darius, would attempt to defeat or to conquer them. Anthony Kaldelis took that a step further. Procopius of Caesarea's discussion of the Ephthalites, the White Huns, echoes Herodotus. Quote, "They are not nomads like the other Hunnic people, but since ancient times have been established in fertile lands. It is also true that their lifestyle is unlike that of the Huns, nor do they live a savage life like the Huns do. But they are ruled by one king, and since they possess a lawful polity, they observe right and justice in their dealings, both with one another and with their neighbors, no less than the Romans and the Persians do." End of quote. Like the Scythians, the Ephthalites are apori, and defeat the Persians by leading them astray and into traps. But, and I quote again, "For the Ephthalites to attain parity with the Persians and the Romans must be lowered to the level of the archetypically barbaric Persians and the vaguely Scythian Ephthalites." End of quote. To quote Herodotus is to say that in the 6th century the empire was nothing but, and I quote again, "lawless despotism in which tyranny has displaced politia." End of quote. Nonetheless, to many, Procopius remains the most important source for the history of the 6th century nomads. Alexander Sarantis fills in the blanks. As a consequence of a combined land and seaborne expedition that Emperor Justinian ordered against them in 528, the Huns living in and around the city of Bosporus disappear from the historical record. According to Alexander Sarantis, quote again, "This resulted partly from their nomadic lifestyle, with its seasonal movements and periodic raids on settled communities," end of quote. No historian seems to be aware that the Herodotian cliché presents a double challenge. Nomads are defined by means of what they are not and don't do, but that is an apophysis. Some of Herodotus' Scythians actually practice agriculture. Procopius' Ephthalites have a city named Gorgo, and the Huns of 528 lived in or near the city of Bosporus. Johannes Gishauf studied the image of the steppe nomads in late antiquity and the Middle Ages, barbarians, monsters, and the scourge of God. But what exactly was a steppe nomad? The logical impasse results from the title of a recent article on the medieval nomads. Quote, "Geographic and political background of medieval nomads settling in the steppes of Eastern Europe," end of quote. Scholars now speak of nomadic cities, nomadic states, and the sedentization of the nomads. Archaeologists have jumped on the bandwagon. Nomads can now be identified by means of specific houses, so-called yurts, amulets, or shoes. But nomads typically have no houses. In the late 10th century, echoing Herodotus but also Strabo, Leo the Deacon described the Pechenegs, to whom I will come a little later in my talk, as, and I quote again, "very numerous nomadic people who eat lice and carry their houses with them, living for the most part in wagons." End of quote. In Eastern Europe, the relations between nomads and the Byzantine Empire have recently become a topic of great interest to both historians and archaeologists. First to draw attention to the topic more than 30 years after Gyula Moravcik's pioneering work were two Russian historians, Irina Yermolova and Igor Knyazky. Theirs was a traditional approach with an emphasis on political relations. The effects of the so-called literary turn are of a more recent date. Sergei Kozlov examined the relations between nomads and Byzantium as reflected in the Byzantine narrative tradition. Imagology also inspired the Romanian scholar Monica Dejan and the Polish scholar Alexander Paroni. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian historian Mykola Melnik argues that the Russian historiography of Byzantine nomadic relations should be treated as a form of colonial discourse. If Byzantine authors used ancient stereotypes about nomads, how did that influence the way in which Byzantines dealt with the nomads in the real world? Were ancient stereotypes informing perhaps imperial policies? Were the people called nomads ever aware of the label that Byzantines put on them? How did they react to that? This paper is an attempt to provide some plausible answers to at least some of those questions. As Anatoly Hazanov has put it, the scholarly community currently lacks a generally accepted definition of nomadism. In the Eurasian steppelands, pastoralism was the main, if not the only, economic activity, maintaining herds throughout the year on free-range pastures. That implied seasonal movement within the boundaries of specific grazing territories, a movement involving the entire population and not just one of its segments. Nomadism, in other words, is not transhumance. The nomadic society was based on kinship, but also, and I quote Hazanov on this, on various segmentary systems and genealogies, whether real or spurious, end of quote. In what follows, I will focus on two chronological moments during which the empire came in close contact with the nomads, 6th and 11th century respectively. For each period, I will deal first with the written sources, then turn to the archaeological record before drawing partial conclusions. Besides highlighting chronological and geographic discrepancies in current approaches to the problem, I will raise some critical questions about the understanding of nomadism and its historiographic construction by means of material culture. So let's start with the 6th century. One of the earliest sources dealing with the steppelands north of the Black Sea in the 6th century is Jordanes Getica. To Jordanes, the Black Sea steppe was the region from which the Huns, quote, like a fruitful root of bravest races, sprouted into two hordes of people, Altsiagiri and Sabiri, each with different dwelling places, end of quote. The Sabiri are known from Priscus, but the Altsiagiri do not appear in any other source. According to Jordanes, they lived near Kherson, but in the summer, and I quote again, ranged the plains, their broad domains, end of quote, returning to the Black Sea shore in the winter. Kherson is where traders bring in goods from Asia, and it may not be an accident that the Altsiagiri are associated with an urban and commercial center. There are no nomads in Procopius' Excursus on the Black Sea in Book 8 of his Wars. Among the peoples living between the Caucasus Range and the Caspian Gates, he mentions, quote again, the Huns who are called Sabiri, as well as certain Hunnic tribes. End of quote. Huns is therefore a generic name, and when in need of more precision, Procopius does not hesitate to add a second name as if a species of a genus. Similarly, the people settled by Lake Meotis, and I quote again, were named in ancient times Cimmerian, but are now called Utigurs, end of quote. This just a three-tiered nomenclature. The genus is Huns, the species Cimmerians, and the subspecies Utigurs. The Cimmerians never crossed the Lake Meotis, we are told, at any time, nor did they suspect that they could be crossed, being afraid of something that was really easy simply because they had never attempted to cross and remained utterly ignorant of the possibility. End of quote. At this point, Procopius inserts a story, the trustworthiness of which he seems to doubt. Quote again. As the time went on, they say, if indeed the story is sound, some youths of the Cimmerians were engaged in hunting, and a single doe that was fleeing before them jumped into those waters of the Sea of Azov, that is. The youths, moved either by a thirst for glory or in some sort of competition, or perhaps some supernatural power drove them to it, followed this doe, and absolutely refused to let her go until they came with her to the opposite shore. Then the quarry, whatever it was, immediately disappeared from sight, for in my opinion, it appeared there for no other purpose that the evil might befall the barbarians who lived in that region. Thus, while the youths failed in their hunt, they now found an incentive to battle and plunder. They returned as fast as they could to their own land and revealed to all Cimmerians that these waters could be crossed by them. End of quote. This story is remarkably similar to what Jordanes has to say about the cruel tribe of the Huns who have settled on the farther bank of the Meotid Lake. Procopius and Jordanes probably drew for that on a now lost fragment of Priscus. Procopius uses the story to explain the separation of the Utigurs from the Kutrigurs and to set up the plot of the war between them. The Kutrigurs, who had previously been paid money by Justinian, were defeated by the Utigurs, to whom the same emperor sent rich gifts. As for the Huns, in general, they are said to have settled in the lands north of the Caucasus Mountains, quote, extending westwards as far as the Sea of Azov, end of quote. The Utigurs are also said to have settled in the lands to the east of the Meotis. So even if the Hunnic people are nomads when compared to the Hephthalites, Procopius has nothing to say about nomadism when describing the Huns. The point of the story of the doe chased across the water is to explain not nomadism, but the Kutrigur-Utigur conflict during Justinian's lifetime. Agathias of Myrina, writing in the late 570s or early 580s, viewed the Kutrigurs and the Utigurs as species of a genus called either Scythians or Huns, with no intermediary category. He alludes to the story of the doe chased across the water in order to explain the Hunnic or Scythian migration. During Agathias' lifetime, all, and I quote, all the other Hunnic tribes were still at the height of their fame, though for some reason best known to themselves they had chosen to move south at this time and had encamped not far from the banks of the Danube. End of quote. This serves as an introduction to Agathias' account of the Kutrigur devastating invasion of 558-59, during which, after crossing the frozen Danube, as if on a bridge, Zabergan's horsemen reached the outskirts of Constantinople. The mentions of Kutrigurs not far from the banks of the Danube is therefore an explanation for their rapid movements across the Balkans in the direction of the imperial capital. There is otherwise nothing nomadic about Kutrigurs bivouacking near the Danube. John Malala's Huns are also a generic category. A king of the Huns of the Bosporus named Grod goes to Constantinople in order to convert to Christianity, with Emperor Justinian as a sponsor at the baptismal font. The event is dated 528. Grod returns to his country near Bosporus, a city where trade, we are told, is taking place between Romans and Huns. Grod's task is to, and I quote, to guard the Roman territory, including Bosporus, end of quote. As the Huns began to destroy the idols, melted them down in order to exchange the metal for Roman coins, quote again, the priests of the Huns were furious, killed Grod, and replaced him with his brother Mogil. Those guarding the city, either Roman garrison or Grod's Huns in charge with the defense of Bosporus, were all massacred. In retaliation, Emperor Justinian sent troops under the command of two generals from Scythia Minor and Mercia. Together they expelled the Huns from Bosporus and re-established Roman control over the city. Grod resided near Bosporus, which implies that his Huns were not too far away. If those were pastoralist nomads, Malala's story makes them rather look like the population permanently settled in the hinterland of a Roman city. This is particularly important in light of what one learns about Huns from an appendix attached in the mid-6th century to the epitomized Syriac translation of the now lost ecclesiastical history of Zachariah of Mytilene. To its author, the Kutrigurs were tent dwellers who ate, quote, the meat of cattle, fish, and wild animals, end of quote. No mention is made of where the Kutrigurs lived, but the author of the appendix, most likely a monk from Amida, knew of Huns beyond the Caspian Gate. Upon learning that a bishop from Albania named Cardust and 7 priests had embarked on a mission to the Huns, Justinian ordered that food and wine, garments, and liturgical vessels be dispatched from the nearest cities. None of those cities is named, but since they were under Roman rule, they must have been located on the Black Sea coast, somewhere north of the Caucasus Mountains. They could not have been too far from the abodes of the Huns, much like Jordanes Alciagiri and Grod's Huns in John Malalas. Those to whom Cardust and his companions spread the word of God were therefore associated with urban centers on the coast. Kutrigurs among tent dwellers remind one of a slightly later source, Menander the Guardsman, written under Emperor Maurice, 582-602. In one of the fragments surviving in his now lost history, Menander has Emperor Justinian putting pressure on Sandilch, the leader of the Utigurs, to attack Zabergan and destroy the Kutrigurs. Sandilch refused to attack his fellow tribesmen, and I quote, "For they not only speak our language, dwell in tents like us, dress like us, and live like us, but they are our kin, even if they follow other leaders." End of quote. Instead of destroying the Kutrigurs, he offered to take all their horses, and I quote again, so that without their mounts they will be unable to pillage the Romans. End of quote. Neither the Utigurs nor the Kutrigurs are described as nomads. The reference to horses is quite clearly meant to point out that Kutrigurs fight on horseback. To take their horses is not to inflict damage upon their pastoralistic economy, but to prevent them from waging war against the empire. However, Menander, like Procopius, was counting on his audience's knowledge of and ability to recognize Herodotus' archetypal Scythians. In another surviving fragment, an Avar envoy asks Emperor Tiberius II, "Do you not have writings and records from which you can read and learn that the tribes of the Scythians are impossible to defeat and conquer?" End of quote. Like Herodotus' Scythians, Menander the Guardsman's Avars are apori. However, that stereotype is not applied ever, either to the Kutrigurs or the Utigurs. With the exception of Jordanes, therefore, no 6th century author dealing with the steppe lands north of the Black Sea mentions anything about nomadism. Jordanes, on the other hand, describes the seasonal movements of a group, the Alciagiri, that appears in no other source. The Alciagiri are mentioned in relation to Kherson, and other authors associate the Huns with Roman cities on the coast. What then is the basis for treating the northern neighbors of the empire as nomads? Why are historians so interested in perpetuating an ethnographic stereotype, ultimately derived from Herodotus' description of Scythians? In antiquity and the early Middle Ages, the Black Sea lowlands offered optimal conditions for pastoralism, albeit more of a transhuman than of a nomadic kind. There are 3 main areas in which transhuman pastoralism could have possibly been successfully practiced: the Bujak Plain to the northwest, the central Black Sea lowlands, including the Crimean lowlands, and the Kuban lowlands, so-called Prigubanskaya Nizemnost, to the northeast. It has long been suggested that the end of occupation on a number of sites in the hinterland of Bosporus, we're talking about this area here, came with the revolt against Grod, the Hunnic king of Bosporus. But more recent excavations at the eastern end of the Kerch Peninsula have shown that during the 3rd quarter of the 6th century, many previously abandoned sites were reoccupied or even enlarged. Could Huns have lived in any of those settlements? There is theoretically not an impossibility there. But there are no signs of pastoralism, much less of pastoral nomadism. Moreover, there is an abundance of imported pottery, African red slip wares, and amphorae. Field surveys have identified numerous sites along the northern Donets and its main tributaries and around the Taganrog Bay. I'm talking about the area here just north of the Sea of Azov. Those are territories far away from any city under Roman control in the 6th century. Under the assumption that those were lands controlled by the nomads, all those sites have been interpreted as campsites. However, and despite the fact that none has so far been systematically excavated, the field surveys have produced abundant ceramic material, including amphora shards, some of which may be dated to the 6th century. Given the abundance of the ceramic material, one wonders if occupation on those sites was truly impermanent. Contemporary settlement sites are also known from the Lower Dnieper area in the central Black Sea lowlands. Salvage excavations carried out in the 1950s in Ihreni have produced dress accessories, bracelets, fibulae, belt fittings that suggest a mid to late 6th century date for the earliest occupation on the site. Stray finds from the Kislevo island, now under the water of the Dniprovsky reservoir, may well have been of the same date. Similar materials are also known from Zvonetske and Valoske. Those are most likely permanent settlements, not campsites. Moreover, the bracelet, fibula, and bell fittings that you have seen on those slides are either of early Byzantine origin or imitations of artifacts from the empire. There are no settlements of any kind in the Bujak, so in the northwestern part of the steppe lands north of the Black Sea. That region has been the object of several systematic studies regarding the material correlates of nomadism for various periods in history, from Bronze Age all the way to the late Middle Ages. There are no 6th to 7th century campsites or village so far identified. A 200-kilometer wide belt separates the nearest points on the early Byzantine frontier in Crimea. So this is the Lower Dnieper area. Some of the sites, the slides of which you have seen, are here, here, and here. So Crimea is all the way down. But the same phenomenon could be seen in the Bujak plain, that is to say, in the northwestern part. So this is Crimea, this is Dobruja, 2 territories that on both sides of the Black Sea that were actually under Roman control at that time. And those are the closest settlements to that line there. So 200-kilometer wide belt separates the nearest points on the early Byzantine frontier on the Lower Danube or in the Crimea from the first settlements to the north, all of which appear at the interface of the Black Sea lowlands with the Byrlat, Kogolnik, and Podolian uplands. This no-man land may have something to do with the fortification of the northern frontier of the empire during the mid and late 6th century. The fortification of Dobruja and the Crimea suggests that early Byzantine provinces were under some serious threat from the north, that is, from the steppe lands. Scholars have pointed to numerous attacks, raids, and invasions from across that frontier that are mentioned actually in the written sources. They, however, have paid comparatively less attention to the effects of the fortification upon settlements to the north from that frontier. 15 years ago, in a book that was mentioned here earlier on, I have suggested that Emperor Justinian's grandiose program of fortification in the Balkans had considerable impact economically and socially on communities north of the lower Danube. But settlements in the northwestern region of the Black Sea are not next to that frontier, as in Wallachia, but at a considerable distance from it. Although commonly depicted as under siege by barbarian hordes, the early Byzantine troops sometimes crossed that frontier to wage war on barbarians in their own lands. John Malalas mentioned 2 commanders of troops from Scythia Minor and Thrace moving by land against the Huns of Bosporus. They must have marched their troops across the steppe in the Black Sea lowlands, from Bulgaria all the way to the Kerch Peninsula. At least some of those attacks across the lower Danube, carried in the 530s by Magister Militum per Thraciam Hilbudius, may have been launched from Dobruja. The settlements in the northern and northwestern region of the Black Sea were therefore located at a sufficiently large distance to avoid attacks from the south, that is, from the empire. That the Black Sea lowlands were a region of contact with the empire also results from the distribution of 42 coin finds known so far. The contrast between the Bujak and the region of the Sea of Azov is evident. As you can tell, lots of coins here, very few in the area of the Sea of Azov. Out of 7 finds in the Sea of Azov area, 4 are of hoards of gold coins, 3 of them within a relatively small area of the Luhansk-Donetsk region of Ukraine. I'm talking about those 3 here. The fact that all coins from the Beloyarivka hoard are 20-carat lightweight solidi struck for Emperor Justinian, all of the same date, strongly suggests that that collection did not exchange many hands before reaching the Azov lowlands. This may represent payments or bribes sent from Constantinople for some chieftain in the region. Moreover, the 3 hoards may also point to a local center of power. The coins from the Limarivka hoard were found in a 5th or early 6th century Sasanian silver bottle. A Sasanian ewer decorated with semirf was associated to 2 silver cups and remains of a wooden saddle in a mound burial accidentally found in 1855 in Pavlivka. There are other exceptionally rich burial assemblages in the Azov lowlands. 2 of them have been found in 1868 in Morskoy Chulek on the northern shore of the Sea of Azov. The assemblage engraved 2 included a gold chain with a medallion, 2 gold earrings with cloisonné decoration, 2 gold bracelets, one of them shown here with the Latin inscription, 2 finger rings, and several fragments of almandine and lazurite cabochons. Another rich grave was been found in Jiginka, which is on the eastern side of the Taman Peninsula. The most interesting item in that assemblage is a double gold chain, the clasp of which is made of a mounted, rare solidus. That's a joint reign issue of Justin I and Justinian, struck at some point between April and August 527. One is almost tempted to associate the gold chain with Grod's conversion to Christianity. Be as it may, and I'm not going to make that argument, there is a clear contrast between the few hoards in the east, each with a relatively large number of gold coins, and the numerous finds of individual copper coins in the west. In my opinion, this contrast bespeaks different relations with the empire. While the large collections of coins and exceptionally rich grave goods in the east may reflect diplomatic relations with Constantinople, the copper coins in the west point to much more modest relations with the forts in Dobruja, perhaps market exchanges. Given the scarcity of information provided by settlement archaeology, coin and stray finds, it is not at all surprising that archaeologists interested in the 6th century history of the Black Sea area, particularly the steppe lands, have turned to cemetery and isolated graves. To date, over 40 6th to 7th century burial sites are known from the entire northern Black Sea area, all inhumations. Those fall into one of Anatoly Ambrosi's groups 4, 5, and 6. Group 4, which the Soviet archaeologists interpreted as representing the lower class or the commoners of the steppe society, consists of burials with no weapons but with buckles, mounts, strap-ends with open-work ornament. By contrast, Group 5 includes extraordinarily rich burials such as Kelegia, and that's just a piece of an extraordinarily rich burial assemblage. Finally, Ambrose included in his Group 6 burial assemblages such as found in Sivashke and Kovalivka, in which a human was buried together with a horse or parts of a horse skeleton, such as the skull and the legs. To Ambrose, those were the warriors of the steppe. Ambrose is a rather simplistic model of Marxist inspiration, with classes based on wealth differentials resulting from the pastoralistic economy. More recently, Rashev and Oleksiy Komar have questioned his model primarily on chronological grounds. But the chronological distinctions drawn between Svashivka and Sukhanova groups or finds are themselves problematic. To the correspondence analysis of 27 burial assemblages, I have demonstrated the absence of any perceptible distinctions between assemblages attributed to one or the other group. They are all of about the same age, 2 or 3 decades on either side of AD 600. The earliest assemblage in the Black Sea lowlands cannot be dated before 500, as indicated by belt buckles of the Sukidava class, such as found in Suhanova here and Veliki Tokmak. We're talking about those buckles. Moreover, like hordes of gold coins, exceptionally rich burials appear to the east from the Sea of Azov, while poorer assemblages are to the west from that sea. This is true both for the earlier and for the later assemblages. All those graves were dug into prehistoric, primarily Bronze or Iron Age mounds. There are many thousands of such mounds in the steppe lands north of the Black Sea, but only a few were selected for reuse. Within one and the same group of barrows, no more than a couple received new burials. With one exception, no prehistoric mound has more than one early medieval burial, often placed in the center of the barrow. Burying the dead into ancient barrows was a 6th century idea, most likely meant to make certain burials more visible in the landscape, and thus to communicate the status of an individual or of a family. Prehistoric mounds were regarded as old, and therefore prominent people were buried in barrows. Such practices may have been connected with claims to ancestors supposedly buried underneath those mounds. The pit of an exceptionally rich grave was dug into a prehistoric mound in Vasilivka near Novotroitsky on the left bank of the lower Dnieper. So this is the image on the left. The closest analogy for the gold strap ends and mounds shown there with garnet cabochons are those from a burial dug into a prehistoric mound in Madara in Bulgaria. That was an exceptional burial, which may well have been that of a chieftain. Its proximity to an early Byzantine fort, which may well have, which was certainly still in operation at the time of the burial, is remarkable. No other contemporary graves have been found in Madara. The chieftain grave was an isolated burial placed on the northern side of the prehistoric mound. Its isolation strongly suggests that the deceased was an important person, and the associated horse skeleton and grave goods do not contradict that interpretation. With the exception of a few children, almost all those buried under prehistoric barrows in the Black Sea lowlands were men. Why were there no females in the steppe? If those were burials of nomads, where are their women and children? 40 graves is too small a number to account for the numerous nomads mentioned at various moments in the history of the 6th century. Several burial assemblages include sheep bones, typically the legs placed next to the human skull. Faunal remains are also mentioned for a number of settlements in the northern and northwestern Black Sea area, but no analysis has so far been carried on any of them. A number of buildings of circular plan found in some of those settlements have been interpreted as yurts on the basis of what I think are ill-thought analogies with Kalmyk kibitkas known from 19th century ethnographic reports. However, paleobotanical samples have been collected from settlements with yurts, which indicate the cultivation of cereals, an economic option which runs clearly against the idea of nomadism. Soviet, Russian, and Ukrainian archaeologists typically oppose settlement sites in the north, which they attribute to the Slavs, a sedentary population, to burial sites in the steppe lands, which they attribute to the nomads. In fact, there are indications more of commonality than of difference. Belt buckles of the Sukidava class, as shown on the slide earlier on, strap ends and belt mounts with open work ornament are known from both burial and settlement sites. Three-edged arrowheads, interpreted as nomadic, are also known from both settlement sites and mound burials. But the most important link between burial and settlement sites is pottery. Pots with relatively long necks and outflaring rings with no decoration whatsoever, such as found in Ajigyolch, Ramorsky, and Risove, are known from Penkivka and Stetsivka. Pottery with finger impressions on the lip has been found in graves as well as settlements. The pottery with vertical comb decoration, such as found at Veliki Tokmak, is also known from 2 sunken feature buildings in Dodeshti. The archaeological evidence thus suggests that the 6th and early 7th century burials in the Black Sea lowlands were not of nomads coming from afar, but of members of communities that occupied settlements at the interface between the steppe and the steppe forest belts. Upon death, the remains of most inhabitants of such settlements, men, women, children, were buried in neighboring cremation cemeteries. Only a few men were given a special treatment with isolated inhumations in prehistoric barrows, sometimes accompanied by horses and exquisite grave goods. Whether or not these men died during seasonal migrations associated with transhuman pastoralism, their burials were not graves of pastoralists, but monuments of power and prestige. That their burials clustered in the Crimean lowlands and the steppe between the river Bug and the western shore of the Sea of Azov strongly suggest that such monuments are also markers of territory and influence. Some of those men may have been leaders of communities. Procopius mentions one Simeon, a veteran of Justinian's wars against the Vandals in Africa and the Goths in Italy. In the mid-6th century, he resurfaces as the head of a large group of 2,000 Kutrigurs, men, women, and children, petitioning the emperor to settle in Thrace. No mention is made of any animals that they may have brought with them. When accepting them into the empire, Justinian must have known that they were not nomads, for they could not have otherwise adapted to the environmental conditions in Thrace, which were completely different from those in the steppe lands north of the Black Sea. Whatever nomad meant to Justinian himself, he certainly did not attach that label to the immigrants. Thrace was a rich agricultural province with lots of cities. Simeon's Kutrigurs were apparently quite capable of adapting to their new home. Let's now turn to the 11th century. Taken in the mass, this is a nation to be feared, and a treacherous one. Thus wrote Michael Sellos about the Western barbarians, whom he regarded as closer to the realm of animals than to the society of humans. I quote, "When they are thirsty, if they find water, either from springs or in the streams, they at once throw themselves down into it and gulp it up. If there is no water, each man dismounts from his horse, opens its veins with a knife, and he drinks the blood. So they quench their thirst by substituting blood for water. After that, they cut up the fattest of the horses, set fire to whatever wood they find ready to hand, and having slightly warmed the chopped limbs of the horse there on the spot, they gorge themselves on the meat, blood and all. The refreshment over, they hurry back to their primitive huts and lurk like snakes in the deep gullies and precipitous cliffs which serve as their walls." End of quote. Many at the time agreed with Sellos. Gregory Pacurianus, the domestic of the West under Emperor Alexius I, described them, and I quote, as the most terrible and most arrogant enemies who set themselves not only against the Roman Empire, but also every race of Christians. End of quote. John Mavropus compared them to frogs in a swamp. Ataliates was also disgusted with their eating habits, which he described as impure. However, they were all writing half a century or more after the first Pecheneg raids into the empire. Moreover, they all treated them as people from the north, greedy, insatiable, arrogant, boasting, as well as untrustworthy. They also referred to them by names of ancient peoples, Scythians and Mysians. Skylitzes, who sometimes calls them Patzinax, explains that the Pechenegs were in fact, quote, Scyths pertaining to the so-called royal Scyths, end of quote. Echoes of Herodotus are even stronger in Theophylact of Ohrid's encomium for Emperor Alexius I. None of those authors knew about the extensive account of the Pechenegs, which Emperor Constantine Porphyrogenitus had written more than a century earlier. Many had therefore only limited knowledge about the Pechenegs on the other side of the Danube. Psellos knew that Pechenegs had moved because, and I quote, of the activities of the Getae, their neighbors, who by their plundering and ravaging compelled them to abandon their own homes and seek new ones, end of quote. Anna Komnina regarded the Pechenegs as the Scythian tribe, which, and I quote again, having suffered incessant pillaging at the hands of the Sarmatians, left home and came down to the Danube, end of quote, where they entered negotiations with the local people. Tselgu was, she says, the supreme commander of the Scythian army, who had with him a great number of Sarmatians, Scyths, and Dacians, but Anna had no knowledge of where the army had come from, even though she mentioned it crossing on the upper Danube valley. By contrast, John Skylitzes knew of 13 Pecheneg tribes, quote again, all of which have the same name in common. But each tribe has its own proper name inherited from its own ancestor and chieftain, end of quote. He even names 2 tribes under Kegian's command, Belemarnis and Pagumanis, which are not on Emperor Constantine's list. Skylitzes has the Pechenegs grazing, quote, their flocks on the plains which extend beyond the Danube, from the river Boristenon, which is the Dnieper, to Pannonia, end of quote. He therefore described them, quote again, as nomads who always preferred to live in tents, end of quote. But he also claims that Tirax Pechenegs settled in the desert plain of Bulgaria between Sardike, Naissos, and Eftsapolis. When joining the Pecheneg rebels returning from an expedition to Iberia, their fellow tribesmen were equipped, I quote again, with rustic axes, scythes, and other iron tools taken from the fields, end of quote, an indication that they were familiar with, if not actually practicing, the cultivation of crops. That Pechenegs could be agriculturists even without the pressure of the imperial government results from Anna Komnena's remark that, when not waging war, the Pechenegs, quote again, tilled the soil and sowed millet and wheat, end of quote. The late 11th century authors writing about the Pechenegs have little to say about daily life, customs, dress, political institutions. This is surprising, given the relatively large number of Byzantine prisoners who spent some time among the Pechenegs and could offer details about them. One of those POWs, Nikephoros Melissenos, a Byzantine general, even wrote to Emperor Alexios I from captivity to inform him about the plans of the Pechenegs had to sell their prisoners of war. Sometimes the Byzantines were sufficiently close to their enemies to know that when parting they were dancing to flutes and cymbals, or that some of their leading men spoke the language of the Cumans. Skylitzes calls Tirach a Vasilevs and explains that Kegen received from Constantine IX, quote, 3 of the fortresses standing on the banks of the Danube and many hectares of land, end of quote. It means unclear what exactly was granted to Kegen, the actual fortresses or the revenue from the tax-exempted hectares of land in their hinterland. If the latter, Kegen is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, recipient of a pronia. Anna Komnena has an interesting story about the Byzantine perception of Pechenegs. Blocked by Pechenegs at Hirovanhi, Emperor Alexius made a sortie against his enemies, who were, quote, getting ready for a meal and rest, end of quote, while others were busy plundering the hinterland. After killing some and taking many prisoners, the emperor, quote again, clothed his soldiers in the Scyth's uniform and told them to ride the Scythian horses, end of quote. He then, quote again, went down with the Scythian standards and his men clad in Scythian uniforms to the river which flows near Hirovanhi, end of quote. The returning Pechenegs, seeing them standing there and mistaking them for their fellow tribesmen, fell into the trap and were massacred or captured. Alexius then returned to Constantinople with the prisoners in a convoy, having, quote again, the men holding the Scythian standards, end of quote, first, followed by captives, quote again, each guarded by natives of the country, that is, by the Byzantines. Others held aloft the severed heads of the Pechenegs on spears, and behind them, at a moderate distance, was the emperor himself with his men and the Roman standards. This bizarre procession was sufficiently convincing to fool George Palaeologus, who caught up with it in the plain of Dimilia and thought that he had stumbled upon Pecheneg marauders. The story is significant because it implies that there definitely were such things as Pecheneg uniforms, horses, and standards. While one may be ready to admit the historical reality of the latter, perhaps also inclined to imagine smaller horses of a species easy to distinguish from the horses the Byzantine soldiers rode. It means unclear what exactly was the Scythian uniform. That Anna's story is not to be taken at face value results from her comment upon the reaction of George Palaeologus. Quote, on this occasion, the use of Scythian uniforms tricked and deceived our own folk, end of quote. Initially used by the Byzantines to trick the Pechenegs, the Pecheneg dress can now confuse the Byzantines themselves. The story is therefore meant as a joke and is indeed reminiscent of the parodos in Thesmophoriazusai, with a strong emphasis on the comical effects of cross-dressing and disguise. Archaeologists dare to differ. They have long identified the Pechenegs with destruction and massacre. The Pechenegs are believed to have settled on the sites of the destroyed settlements, and various categories of artifacts have been attributed to them. Clay kettles, handmade pottery, leaf-shaped pendants with open-work ornament, horseman-shaped amulets, jingle bells, bridle mounts, arrowheads, and of course stirrups. Clay kettles, for example, were believed to have originated in the East. But more recent studies have established that clay kettles appear in Bulgaria long before the earliest Pecheneg raid mentioned in the written sources. Over 400 specimens are known from a site in Bulgaria, Topola, 7 of which were found intact in a kiln excavated there. A different type of clay kettle appears on sites in northeastern Bulgaria in the 11th century. Clay kettles also appear in 10th and 11th century sites in Moldavia and Wallachia, but not to the east of the river Dniester or in left bank Ukraine. That region to the east of that river, of that line, is the one that, according to the written sources, was inhabited most certainly by the Pechenegs in the 10th and 11th century. There is therefore no reason to treat this category of pottery as nomadic pottery. Ever since Svetlana Pletnyova and German Fyodorov Davidov, the archaeological evidence pertaining to the medieval nomads of the Eurasian steppelands has been primarily collected from burial sites. Fyodorov Davidov distinguished several groups of burials, the first one of which he dated to the late 10th and 11th century. Most typical for that group, according to him, are burials in small barrows or more often graves dug into prehistoric mounds, either no grave pits properly speaking or only small pits. the deposition of the skull and legs of a horse, commonly on the left side of the human skeleton, either directly in the pit or in a small adjacent niche. Sometimes the pit floor is covered with organic material, perhaps the hide of the sacrificed horse. Cenotaphs, in which there are no human bones, just the skull and the legs of the horse, and finally, the west-east orientation of the grave. All this is supposedly illustrated by finds in Belaveja, Sarkel, in the Volgograd region of Russia, the largest cemetery of its kind in Eastern Europe. Svetlana Pletmiova says even advanced the idea that the snaffle beads with rigid mouthpieces, such as shown on this slide, were typically Pecheneg. Nonetheless, the earliest graves in the Black Sea lowlands display few, if any, of the supposed characteristic of Fyodorov Davidov's first group. Instead, the rich assemblage from Novokamyanka includes silver brill mounts decorated in a style directly inspired by Byzantine art. Of a similar date is the silver belt set from a grave found under a prehistoric mound in Badrajiveki. Almost all burial assemblages attributed to the Pechenegs have been dug actually into prehistoric barrows, which must have been taller in the 11th century than they are now. Most are less than 60 miles away from the river Danube. 12 out of 21 graves with weapons are shown here with square, such as this one. So 12 out of 21 graves with weapons are also located close to the Danube. On the other side of the Danube, to the south, most Byzantine strongholds known to have been in operation during the 11th century are either on the bank of the river or within a very short distance from it. This distribution reminds one of the Crimea, where 10th and 11th century graves with weapons, all in prehistoric mounds, appear within a short distance from the main Byzantine settlement area centered upon Kherson and Sudak. In the Valetian plain, the Bujak and the Crimean lowlands, the prehistoric mounds in which a few select warriors had been buried were prominent features in the steppe landscape. But where did all those warriors come from? Where are their homes and their families? Archaeologists currently draw a sharp distinction between the native settlement sites and the burial sites of the late nomads. The former are believed to have survived the onslaught of the nomads well into the 11th century. You see, the abandonment of native settlements in Wallachia, southern Moldavia, and the Bujak began in the mid-11th century, and the population moved out completely, as you can tell, nothing in the stepplands here, by the late 12th century. During the first half of the 11th century, natives and nomads, however, coexisted peacefully, as indicated by a follis of Class B found in a sunken feature building of the native settlement excavated in Shendreni, only 12 miles across the Danube from the Byzantine stronghold at Garvan. Artifacts commonly associated with Pecheneg burials, arrowheads, snaffle beads with rigid mouthpieces, leaf-shaped pendants with open-work ornaments, have been found on several native sites as well. There was therefore no physical separation between natives and late nomads, and it is quite possible that the homes and the families of the warriors buried in prominent barrows in the steppe were in villages such as Shendren. This is in sharp contrast to the lack of archaeological evidence pertaining to the Pechenegs in the Balkans. There are no 11th century graves in burial mounds in Dobruja or Bulgaria, no weapon burials. Even burials with the skull and legs of a horse next to the human skeleton are different from those north of the river Danube. 2009 excavations in Histria have revealed the burial of a woman buried together with a skull and the legs of a horse and a snaffle bead with rigid mouthpiece. Similarly, leaf-shaped pendants with open-work ornament that are believed to be typically Pecheneg artifacts have been found only in female or child burials. Two such pendants have been found on the same site at Histria, with another female skeleton buried in the ruins of a Roman bath. Both pendants were found next to the jawbone and were most likely part of a necklace, including 11 glass beads of various colors. To date, 35 pendants of such type are known from the lower Danube region, many of them from the lands south, not north of the river Danube. No such pendants appear in the central Black Sea lowlands, and the only analogies are from sites located to the east from the river Don, way out there to the east. The westernmost specimen from that region is in fact a child burial in Sarkel. In other words, leaf-shaped pendants with open-work ornaments appear in two regions of Eastern Europe at a distance of more than 900 miles from each other. More important, they do not appear in those regions where Pechenegs are known to have lived during the 10th and the 11th centuries. How could this be explained? It is important to know that 5 times more pendants are known from the lands south than from the lands north of the river Danube. Moreover, of all Balkan pendants, only one specimen from Histria may be compared to those in the lower Volga region. It is only in the 11th century that exotic dress accessories, such as those from the lower Volga, could have become the fashion in the northern Balkans. I would suggest that the adoption of that fashion has much to do with the political changes taking place in the middle decades of that century, particularly with the confrontation between Kegen and Tirak, the creation of an almost independent Pecheneg district in the Hundred Hills region, and the Pecheneg-Cuman conflicts. This is further substantiated by the examination, very briefly, of the largest 11th century cemetery so far found in that area. No less than 535 graves have been found during the excavations carried between 1983 and 1991 at the foot of the hill on which stood the Byzantine fortress in Oghuz. Almost half of those graves are of children, often buried with a large stone over the head, the chest, or the feet. The most spectacular feature revealed by anthropological analysis is that more than a third of all skeletons have trephine skulls. Those are individuals who died between 30 and 40 years of age, 20 males, 23 females. All are instances of what we call symbolic trepanation, meaning that the surgical operation performed on a cranial vault of a living subject did not penetrate the inner table of the skull. The purpose of that operation may have been or believed to be medical, but its high incidence in Oghuz betrays ritual concerns. The distribution of graves with trephine skulls and stone-lined graves, respectively, are mutually exclusive. Several graves contain charcoal and traces of fire, purification of the grave pit. Some produced animal bones, cattle, sheep, pig, horse. They cluster on the western part of the cemetery. Grave with coins cluster in the central and eastern part of the cemetery. There are fewer burials with bracelets in the western than in the central and eastern parts of the cemetery. This is also true for the distribution of bridal mounds of various shapes, which were found in 30 relatively rich assemblages, either with graves of young women or with child burials. Such mounds commonly appear around the neck of the skeleton, underneath the jawbone, or on the forehead. Irrespective of their size, many have two diametrically opposed holes and traces of thread, which suggest that they were stitched to some fabric, perhaps a linen head cover or a headband. It has been suggested that outside the Balkans, such mounds decorated only the bridle and were found, therefore, only in graves with horse remains. Because of that, the people buried in Oghuz here must be Pechenegs, especially since no settlement was found in the vicinity, a supposedly clear sign of a nomadic group, because they disappear so quickly. However, the cemetery in Oghuz has nothing in common with burial assemblages found north of the Black Sea or near the Danube River. There are no parallels in those assemblages for the idea of burying together large numbers of children and adults, for inhumations with stone-lined graves, and for large-scale trepanation. What about the bridal mounds? The bridal mounds found around the head of the woman in grave 326 have analogies in other graves in Oghuz, but not on sites north of the Danube River or the Black Sea. Even more instructive is to plot the analogies for the many dress accessories found in that grave, just for that grave alone. They appear to be much stronger, as you can see, on a northwestern and southwestern rather than in a northern and northeastern direction. With few exceptions, there are no analogies in the whole of Eastern Europe for the dress accessories of the woman buried in grave 376. There is, in other words, no reason for taking grave 376 for a nomadic, much less a Pecheneg burial, and such skepticism, in my opinion, must also be extended to the interpretation of the entire cemetery. There is currently no explanation for the gender-specific use of such artifacts as leaf-shaped pendants in the bridal mounds, or the lack of any archaeological correlate of the martial poses of the Pecheneg chieftains that are so well documented in the written sources. Furthermore, nobody seems to have noted that the contrast between burial rituals north and south of the river Danube actually matches the testimony of the written sources. Many sources, no doubt perpetuating an old topos of the ethnographic literature, claim that the barbarians were transformed one way or another after crossing the Danube. Nomads came to know about food and beverages of which they had no previous knowledge. They accepted baptism. They settled and turned to the cultivation of crops. They formed political alliances and were capable of agreeing to long-term peace treaties with the empire. In short, they got civilized. As the evidence from Anna Komnina's Alexiad seems to suggest, in order to survive, the Byzantines too had to become a bit more like the Pechenegs, to adopt their ways of living and fighting, to incorporate their tactics, and to learn their language. One has therefore every reason to wonder about the archaeological invisibility of the Pechenegs in the Balkans. The cluster of burial monuments in the Valetian plain and in the Bujak in plain sight of the Byzantine fortresses on the right bank of the river Danube suggests that the material culture attributed to the Pechenegs before and during their migration to the Balkan provinces was already influenced, if not even conditioned, by the political and military developments in the empire. The existence of large cemeteries with stone-lined graves in northeastern Bulgaria, such as Oghuz presented here, must equally have a social and political explanation. According to the written sources, this was the region of the Balkans inhabited by a mixed population, to which Michael Ataliates referred with a phrase lifted from the ancient literature, mixovarvari, including large numbers of Pechenegs. It seems as if traits that were not at all prominent in the archaeological record of the East European steppelands, trepanation, bridle mounts recycled as dress accessories, became activated to mark the material culture boundaries for a new sense of group identity. Without names of political and military leaders, Byzantine authors were incapable of differentiating between groups and do not seem to have been aware of their possible different identities. All treated the Pechenegs as a single nation with multiple tribes, a typical stereotype about nomads in late antique ethnography, which reminds one of Procopius' Cimmerians and John Malala's Huns. But the archaeological evidence shows not only that the nomads outside the empire may have well been a sedentary population practicing transhuman pastoralism, but also that sedentary population inside the empire emulated successful nomads that had entered the empire. Elements regarded as reflections of the traditions of the steppe may have well been quotes designed to give a Pecheneg look to original identity at a time of considerable political and social turmoil. It is no accident that the markers of that look were attached especially to the dress of young women and children. Bearing them with leaf-shaped pendants with open-work ornament may have been a way to signal political and military allegiance. Because of their ephemeral success in establishing an almost independent polity in the northern Balkans and the resounding victories they had obtained against many armies sent from Constantinople against them, the Pechenegs may have appeared in the 11th century as upstarts worth emulating. Two leaders of the Paulician rebels in the environs of Philippopolis, Lekas and Travlos, most certainly thought so when marrying Pecheneg princesses. But you do not have to take their word for it. Anna Komnena paints a vivid image of the men following her father, Emperor Alexios I, all dressed up in Scythian uniforms, riding Scythian horses, and with Scythian standards standing in wait on the bank of the river in Hirovanki. Would you not say they look just like Pechenegs? Thank you.